When it comes to Rome and the culture, burials and funeral practices held massive significance in terms of religious views and protection of the soul, be it alive or dead. These practices, tied to burial, would entail many strong religious and social customs, as we will discuss throughout the remainder of this video. Before getting started, it's also important to note that many of the practices were shared between Greek and Roman people, so we'd mostly be focusing exclusively and uniquely on Roman funeral practices. Another important thing to note is that in terms of religion during Roman rule, Greek and Roman religion were very similar and practically the same to an extent. But for now, we can begin. First and foremost, I will be discussing Roman religion and its greater significance within the realm of burial practices. So, along with many religions of today, death for Roman people was believed to be a direct transition to the afterlife and was deeply ritualized. It was commonly believed that death was not some eternal damnation or paradise, but a mere continuation of life in a simpler form. Though beliefs did vary at the time, many depictions of Roman afterlife in popular ancient poetry, such as Homer's Iliad, Odyssey, and other poets' work, like Virgil's Aeneid, included the underworld as the realm of the dead, and ruled by the god of the underworld, Pluto, or more popularly known as Hades in Greece. In the underworld, souls would cross the river Styx, a representation of the transition between the living world and the afterlife. Souls would cross in a relatively small boat with the help of the ferryman Charon, a prominent figure in the underworld known for helping souls reach the afterlife. In Roman funerals, a single coin known as Charon's obol would often be placed into the mouth of the deceased person, which they believed the soul of the person would use that same coin in the afterlife as payment to the ferryman Charon to ride across the river Styx. From there, the soul would then be judged and subsequently directed to one of three major realms of the underworld. The first being Elysium, an area of eternal peace and joy, only for the most virtuous and heroic members of society. Most of the people went here, only like the best of the best members of society. Like, again, virtuous and heroic members. It was also believed that most people would arrive in the underworld and wander the Asphodel Meadows for eternity, which would be the second area that most people would end up going to. And that's because that's where most ordinary members of society would end up. And last and unfavorably, wicked souls and those who have committed foul crimes would be sent to the pit of Tartarus, a realm of eternal torture, essentially a hell of sorts. In the land of the living, people believed that honoring the dead with funerary rituals would ensure peace to their spirit and the mind of their soul, or they could return as restless spirits. Upon death, the body was laid on the ground, a symbolic act reflecting the return to earth, and then washed and dressed in attire befitting the individual's social status. For male citizens, this often meant the toga praetexta, or as we would just call it, the toga nowadays, especially if they had held public office. If the deceased had earned a laurel wreath during their lifetime, it was customary to place it upon their head in death. A significant aspect of the preparation, as we mentioned before, the coin, known as Charon's obol, as previously stated. It would go in the mouth of the deceased, which again was intended as a payment to Charon, the ferryman who transported souls across the river Styx to the underworld. The funeral procession, or pompa funebris in Latin, was a public affair that reflected the deceased's social standing. It included family members, musicians, and professional mourners, and they were often women who expressed grief through wailing and self inflicted scratches. Um, it was a very theatrical event. Actors wearing masks or imagines in Latin represented the deceased ancestors. Um, they might also participate celebrating the family's lineage. Um, After the procession, the body was either cremated or buried, depending on the deceased person's personal or familial preferences. It was common during the Republic and early Empire, and the ashes were then collected in urns. Um, Inhumation also gained popularity later, and it was influenced by changing religious beliefs, including the rise of Christianity. And as you can see here, regardless of the method, funerary rites conclude with a feast. And in Latin, it was known as epulae funebras, to honor the deceased and provide culture for the living. And that would conclude my segments of the video. Thank you.
Roman social classes had a significant influence on burial practices, dictating everything from cost and visibility of the burial to who was buried where and how they were remembered. Here's a basic overview of Roman social classes. There were basically 5 main categories of citizens within the Roman Republic. There were patricians and senators, which were basically elite aristocrats in the political class. They were wealthy and often influential landowners. Right below them were the equestrians, who were wealthy business class, not noble by birth, but could be very rich, often involved in commerce, tax collection, and military leadership. Below them are the plebeians. This is the majority of the free Roman citizens. This is like the middle class, one might say. They ranged from moderately well-off tradesmen to poor laborers. Below them are former slaves who had been legally freed, like gladiators who won their freedom, or just any slaves who gained their freedom. They would become freedmen, gain limited citizenship rights, and they could become wealthy but faced stigma within the Republic. And below them, the lowest class of citizen within the Roman Republic were slaves. They were considered property with no legal personhood. So why is Roman social class so important in influencing burial practices? Well, a lot like today, funerals could be very expensive, and not everyone could afford the most lavish funerals, unlike the senators and patricians of the time, who had public processions, actors, musicians, and torchbearers. They were buried in elaborate family tombs or mausoleums. Outside city walls, graves featured sculptures, inscriptions, and ancestral masks. They could afford posthumous honors like statues or public speeches, and their tombs lined major roads to ensure their legacy was visible to the public. Equestrians were wealthy enough to afford impressive tombs, though not as grand as the senatorial class. Often buried in mausoleums or private tombs, their tombs often mentioned business achievements or public service, which was very important to the Romans. Plebeians, or the middle class, most could not afford private tombs. They were often joined in burial clubs to ensure a decent burial. Buried in simple graves, gravestones often included modest inscriptions, occasionally with a symbol or image of their trade. Again, reputation was extremely important, and you could see that in a lot of Roman graves. Freedmen, or former slaves, sought to assert status and honor their new identity, often built personal or family tombs proudly identifying their new liberty. Their tombs often included images of their former masters or patrons, emphasizing their loyalty. Some freedmen became very wealthy, and their tombs could even rival those of the equestrians. Slaves, the lowest class of the Roman social class, had no formal burial rights under Roman law. Some were occasionally buried by their owners as a gesture of affection or appreciation. Occasionally buried in slave cemeteries or shared tombs. If freed, they could later arrange for proper burials as freedmen, but that was pretty rare. Roman law prohibited burial within city limits, so tombs were often built along roads outside cities. High-status individuals chose roads with high visibility for prominent tomb placement. Commoners and freedmen were buried in suburban cemeteries or underground in catacombs, which was especially the case later amongst the Christians. Burial in Rome was not just a personal or religious matter. It was a deeply social and political act, closely tied to one's status, identity, and legacy. In a society obsessed with public reputation, how a person was buried spoke volumes about who they were in life and how they want to be remembered. During the early Roman Republic, around 600 to 400 BCE, burial was basically the only method used to deal with the dead, and that was the case all the way up until the Mid-Republic, which was around 400 to 100 BCE, where cremation began to rise in popularity, especially in urban areas. Still, both burial and cremation were used side by side, often depending on region, class, and personal/family tradition. During the late Republic to the early Empire, 100 BCE to 200 CE, cremation became the dominant practice, especially in Rome and other major cities, seen as cleaner, more efficient, and reflective of Roman values about freeing the soul from the body. During the later Empire, after 200 CE, burial returns to dominance, especially with the rise of Christianity, which favored preservation of the body for resurrection. All social classes used cremation, but how it was done depended on how wealthy you were. Elite Romans had elaborate funerals with large pyres, processions, and urn burials in family tombs and mausoleums, while lower-class citizens might have had communal cremations and simpler urns placed in communal burial chambers. Roman soldiers were often cremated on campaign and their ashes sent home or buried in military cemeteries. Many emperors and members of the imperial family were also cremated. For example, Emperor Augustus was cremated and his ashes placed in the mausoleum of Augustus. Over time, cremation became extremely popular, and that's the case for all the classes of the Roman Republic, especially the middle and upper classes. Believed to release the soul from the body and prevent the dead from haunting the living, it was extremely practical in crowded urban areas just like Rome. Over time, cremation became extremely popular, and that's the case for all the classes of the Roman Republic, especially the middle and upper classes. Believed to release the soul from the body and prevent the dead from haunting the living, it was extremely practical in crowded urban areas just like Rome. Inhumation, or normal burial, has basically always been the preferred method of dealing with the dead throughout the course of human history. It's less costly than cremation in most cases, and definitely a lot simpler, as it's basically just a hole in the ground. Throughout the cremation process, pyres were built from wood, often pine or olive, and the body was placed atop, usually with personal items or offerings. Things like coins over the eyes and nice clothes were put on the person. The burning process lasted several hours, but ancient pyres didn't get as hot as modern crematoriums. As a result, bones were only partially burned, and cremated remains were chunky, not the fine ash we see today. After cooling, the remains were gathered by hands, and select bones were placed into urns, sometimes cleaned and sometimes mixed with other debris. Roman sarcophagi burials represent one of the most elaborate and symbolically rich forms of funerary practices in ancient Rome, particularly during the imperial period, which is around 2nd to 4th century CE. Sarcophagi were primarily used by elite and upper classes, including senators, military leaders, and wealthy merchants. Over time, especially in the late antiquity, They became more common among the emerging Christian community, including bishops and wealthy Christian patrons. Roman sarcophagi were highly decorative and reflected status, beliefs, and identity. Most were carved from marble, others were made of limestone and terracotta. It all depended on wealth and location. What is unique about the Roman sarcophagi is that they all are very different. They all depicted different scenes and different narrative reliefs. Some featured mythical scenes such as the labors of Hercules, Achilles, meant to reflect heroism, virtue, and rebirth, while others depicted the deceased's likeness, which was identically carved into the marble sarcophagus. As mentioned before, inscriptions were quite common to see on ancient Roman graves, as reputation was extremely important in Roman society. These inscriptions were written in Latin or Greek and often included the name, title, age, virtues, poetic writings, and religious dedications of the person.
So, I'll be explaining how architecture relates to Roman burial and funerary practices, and furthermore, look at how this reflects social values, religious beliefs, and identity in Rome in terms of social class and whatnot. So, specifically, we're going to look at 4 architectural locations and see how they relate back to all these other points my group members are trying to make. So let's get straight to it. So we will be looking at next the tomb of Euryses the Baker, being one of the largest and best preserved funerary structures, monuments, whatever we feel like calling it. And this was built around 50 to 20 BCE. And if we look at the pictures, we can see very simple, basic early Roman architectural shapes and design. But the specific burial place just has no superstructure. But below that, we can see reliefs of bread production to kind of celebrate the profession of the person being buried here, Euryses, a baker. And if we look further, this small scale architectural piece symbolizes his social mobility, his desire to want to memorialize his personal achievement. We can also see further how the working class engaged in funerary practices, burial practices, or even through their identity and status can also be shown. And furthermore, we can see how the architecture surrounding it also gives a sense of worker and empire relationship in terms of scale and structures of each other. So first we have the tomb of Cecilia Matea, that was originally a finely constructed building, but now is almost barely intact, but still gives a sense of power and in its very dynamic forms. And as we can see in the photo, it's a cylindrical structure with a side of the building that is really hard to make out, but we can also see it almost has a castle like feeling to it. And this dates back all the way to the 1st century BCE, and it sits on a square base that asserts prestige and stability, located along one of Rome's most famous major roads. And this tomb signifies their position in society because they were able to ensure their family legacy by being able to build it along this road and marking it as a symbol of architectural symbol for power and stability. So next we'll look at the combs of Domitia, And you can see on this first picture right here, this is actually a little bit underground since these are catacombs. And these date back to the 2nd to 5th centuries Common Era, and it reflects a very major shift in funerary custom because now this place is almost like a cemetery and located underground, and it's adorned with Christian imagery. We can see all these fascinating paintings right here, the details, and it's not just this, but various others showing now an interest in Christian imagery, and it's a reinterpretation of Roman funerary spaces, and you could all the iconography really is just about spiritual beliefs, and how you can see in this picture right here, this is more above ground, but more of like the apps that we were talking about in class. And this is all connected back to architecture and how this works as a place to rest, basically. Next, we will be looking at the temple tombs of Kanos in southwest Turkey. And for context, they were under rule during 400 BCE when these were being constructed. Now, if we look at the photos, we can see these grand architectural marvels that are no less symbolizing struggle, wealth, and power, literally carved into the mountain. And this just makes it like immortalizing themselves into the nature, symbolizing their influence above all the people who helped make this, and could also be symbolizing, or not really symbolizing, but they blend the local Turkish culture per se with Roman influence into this amazing work of a feat of engineering, one could say. And this architectural shapes and forms become harmonious and become associated with funeral and burial practices and culture while showing the gap in social class.
The Romans expressed art in their funerary practice in several rich and symbolic ways. Their approach to funerary art was deeply tied to their beliefs about death, the afterlife, family lineage, and social status. Roman funerary art was not just about mourning, it was about memory, identity, and legacy. Through sculpture, reliefs, inscription, and portraiture, they ensured the deceased were honored and remembered across generations. And that opened our eyes to the powerful reflection of cultural synthesis between Roman and Egyptian traditions. Their beauty and depth is not only in their craftsmanship, but also in their profound symbolic and spiritual purposes. The influence can be clearly seen in many artworks, including Without Limitation, the funerary portraits and mosaic used in Roman funerary practice, particularly those from Roman Egypt. For this research, I have chosen Tomb of the Hetairi as a great example of how the Romans practiced their funerary tradition through art, because it vividly illustrates several key elements of Roman attitudes towards death, commemoration, and social identity. I would love to focus on few things here. First, the elaborate reliefs and decoration. The tomb is renowned for its detailed sculptural reliefs, which show funerary rituals, monuments, and scenes of construction. These images serve as both celebration of the deceased's life and demonstration of the family's wealth, status, and accomplishments. For example, some reliefs show architectural works possibly commissioned or built by the Hetairi family, possibly connected to construction or engineering, which promotes their professional pride and legacy. The second thing I love to focus on here is the commemoration of the deceased identity. The tomb likely belonged to a freed woman named Hateria, and the elaborate display reflects how even former slave, once freed and successful, could participate in the elite Roman funerary traditions. It demonstrates how funerary monuments were used to construct and display social identity, especially in the competitive atmosphere of the Roman society. Third, public display of status and piety. The monument was not just a private grave, but a public statement visible to passerby, meant to immortalize the deceased and their family. Reflects Roman values of pietas, duty to family and gods, and preserving memory. Reflects Roman values of pietas, duty to family and gods, and preserving memory. Fourth, funerary rituals depicted in art. Reliefs show scenes of mourning, processions, and ritual, offering insight into how Romans honored the dead. This makes the tomb a valuable source for understanding actual funerary practice, not just beliefs. Fifth, the blend of personal and cultural symbols. The tomb mixes personal achievements with more traditional Roman symbols of death, like the funus imagery, bustes, or references to the underworld, which reveals how Romans balanced individuality and cultural norms in their commemorations.